When people describe their connection with a narcissist as a soul contract, they are often trying to give language to an experience that feels unusually intense, almost fated. There is a sense of recognition of emotional depth, of something that seems to go beyond ordinary relationships. And it's important to honor that feeling, not dismiss it, but to understand it more clearly. Because what feels spiritual on the surface is often deeply psychological underneath. Human beings are wired for connection, but not just any connection. We are drawn to what is familiar at an emotional level. This is where the work of Gabor Mate becomes particularly relevant. He emphasizes that much of what we experience in adult relationships is shaped by early emotional patterns, especially those formed in environments where our needs were not consistently met. These patterns don't disappear as we grow older. They become the blueprint for what feels meaningful, even if it is not healthy. So when an empath encounters a narcissist, something powerful can happen. The empath's capacity for attunement, care, and emotional depth meets the narcissist's need for validation, admiration, and regulation. It creates a dynamic that feels complete, almost as if two missing pieces have found each other. But this sense of completion is not necessarily a reflection of truth. It is often a reflection of complementary wounds. The empath may feel seen in a way they have longed for, especially in the early stages where the narcissist can be highly attentive and engaging. There is intensity, focus, even a kind of emotional mirroring that feels rare. For the empath, this can register as something profound, something that feels like destiny rather than coincidence. But what is actually happening is more nuanced. The narcissist is not necessarily connecting from a place of mutual depth. They are responding in ways that secure emotional engagement. Their attention, their charm, their ability to reflect back what the empath wants to feel. These are often adaptive strategies, not expressions of grounded intimacy. And the empath, whose sensitivity allows them to feel deeply, interprets this engagement as authentic connection. This is where the illusion of a soul contract begins to take shape. It feels real because the emotional experience is real. The intensity is real. The attachment is real. The attachment is real. But the meaning assigned to it, that this was a destined spiritual bond, is often constructed after the fact as a way to make sense of something that is difficult to explain. From a psychological perspective, what is being activated is not fate, but familiarity. The empath may be drawn to the opportunity to give, to heal, to understand. These are not weaknesses. They are not weaknesses. They are strengths. But when they are rooted in earlier experiences where love was conditional or inconsistent, they can become overextended. The narcissist, in turn, is drawn to someone who provides emotional energy without requiring the same level of internal accountability. So the bond forms, not because it was written in some unseen contract, but because it fulfills unconscious needs on both sides. And this is an important distinction, because when the relationship begins to fracture, when the narcissist withdraws, devalues, or ultimately breaks the connection, the empath is left trying to reconcile two conflicting realities. On one hand, the depth of what they felt. On the other, the pain of how it ended. The idea of a soul contract can become a way of holding on to the significance of the experience, even as it becomes increasingly difficult to justify. But clarity begins when we gently question that interpretation. To invalidate the connection, but to understand it more truthfully. What if the intensity was not evidence of destiny, but evidence of activation? What if the depth you felt was not something the narcissist created, but something they triggered within you? Because the capacity for deep connection was always yours. And when you begin to see the relationship through that lens, something shifts. The power begins to return to where it belongs, not in the idea of a contract that was broken, but in the recognition of patterns that can be understood and ultimately changed. Connection may have felt like fate, but the healing begins when you realize it was a reflection. Task, when that bond begins to break, when the narcissist withdraws, devalues, or abruptly disconnects, the experience for the empath is often not just emotional pain. It can feel like something much deeper, almost existential, as if a part of their inner world has collapsed. People describe it as feeling like a spiritual death, and while that language may sound dramatic psychologically, it points to something very real, because what is being lost is not only the person, it is the meaning that formed around them. In many of these dynamics, the empath has invested not just love, but identity into the relationship. Their sense of purpose may have become intertwined with understanding, supporting, or even trying to heal the other person. There is often a quiet belief, sometimes unspoken, that their presence matters in a profound way, that they are the one who sees what others do not, the one who can reach where others could not. And when the relationship ends, that entire structure is shaken. This is where the work of Gabor Mate helps us understand what is happening beneath the surface. He often speaks about how attachment and identity become closely linked, especially when early emotional needs were not fully met. As children, we learn to adapt in order to maintain connection, sometimes by becoming more attuned to others than to ourselves. Over time, this attunement becomes part of who we are. So in a relationship like this, the empath is not just connecting, they're expressing a core part of their identity. When that connection is suddenly removed, it is not experienced as a simple loss. It is experienced as disorientation. The internal compass that once pointed toward the other person no longer has a clear direction. The questions that arise are not just about the relationship, but about the self. Who am I without this? What was real? What did it mean? This is why the pain can feel so consuming. It is not only grief, it is fragmentation. The emotional intensity that once flowed outward now has nowhere to go. The empath may replay moments, searching for clarity, trying to understand how something that felt so meaningful could end in such a way. There is often a tension between what was experienced and what is now evident, and the mind struggles to reconcile the two. At times, this can create a sense of internal collapse. The future that was imagined disappears. The role that was held of being needed, of being connected, no longer exists. And without that role, there can be a temporary loss of structure within the self. This is where the experience begins to resemble what people describe as a spiritual rupture, because it touches on meaning, identity, and purpose all at once. But if we look closely, something else is happening within this collapse. What is being dismantled is not the self, but a version of the self that was organized around the relationship. And this distinction matters, because while the experience feels like an ending, it is also the beginning of a process, one that is not immediately visible and not immediately comfortable. As the ex-day connection fades, attention is slowly, often painfully, redirected inward. The empath begins to encounter parts of themselves that were set aside, neglected, or overshadowed by the focus on the other. This is not a quick or linear process. There may be periods of confusion, longing, even a desire to return to what was, simply to regain a sense of stability. But beneath that, something more fundamental is unfolding. The emotional energy that was once directed outward is beginning to gather within. Time, that energy, can be used differently, not to reconstruct the same dynamic, but to rebuild a sense of self that is less dependent on external validation, less organized around another person's needs, and more grounded in internal awareness. So what feels like a spiritual death is, in many ways, a psychological unraveling of an identity that could not sustain itself without the relationship. It is painful because it is real, but it is also meaningful because it creates the conditions for something more stable, more authentic to emerge. Tains. And perhaps this is the quiet truth at the center of the experience. Sometimes what feels like the end of your world is actually the end of a version of you that was built around losing yourself. While the empath experiences the breaking of this bond as a kind of emotional and existential loss, the narcissist moves through a very different internal process. And understanding this difference is essential, not to judge, but to see clearly what was actually happening within the relationship. Because from the outside, it can be confusing. The same event, the ending of a deeply intense connection, produces two entirely different responses. One person feels grief, disorientation, and a search for meaning. The other appears to shift quickly into distance, defensiveness, or even indifference. This contrast often deepens the empath's pain, creating the illusion that what was meaningful to them was insignificant to the other. But psychologically, the difference lies in what the relationship represented to each person. For the empath, the connection was about bonding. It was about emotional closeness. understanding, and shared experience. Intensity of the relationship was interpreted as depth, as something that reflected genuine connection. When it ends, what is lost is the relationship itself. For the narcissist, however, the relationship often serves a different function. It is less about connection in the mutual emotional sense, and more about regulation. The presence of the empath provides a steady source of attention, validation, and emotional responsiveness. This creates a kind of external system that helps stabilize the narcissist's internal world. It is not that they are consciously calculating this. Rather, it is how their psychological structure has learned to maintain balance. This is where the perspective of Gabor Mate becomes particularly useful. He speaks about how early experiences shape not only our behaviors, but our emotional frameworks, how we relate to others, and what we seek in connection. When those early experiences involve unmet needs or disruptions in attachment, individuals develop strategies to cope. In narcissism, one of those strategies is to rely on external validation as a substitute for internal stability. So when the empath leaves, the narcissist is not primarily experiencing the loss of connection in the same way. What they are experiencing is the loss of regulation. The steady flow of attention is gone. The responsiveness that once affirmed their sense of importance is no longer available. The dynamic that allowed them to feel centered, in control, and significant has been interrupted. Interruption is perceived, often unconsciously, as threat. Not a threat to love, but a threat to control. This distinction is crucial, because it explains why the narcissist's reactions can seem so disconnected from the emotional reality of the relationship. They may become dismissive, defensive, or even critical. They may appear to move on quickly, as if nothing meaningful was lost. But these responses are not necessarily signs of emotional strength. They are forms of psychological protection. To fully feel the loss would require acknowledging dependence, and it would mean recognizing that their sense of self was, in part, sustained by another person, and for a narcissistic structure, that recognition is deeply uncomfortable. So instead, the focus shifts. The mind may frame the situation in terms of control, what was lost, what can be regained, how the dynamic might be restored or replaced. Even the earlier patterns we discussed, replaying the past, attempting indirect contact, rewriting the narrative, are all, in different ways, efforts to reestablish a sense of control over the situation. But beneath those efforts, there is an unspoken reality. The system that once functioned smoothly is no longer operating in the same way. And while the narcissist may not experience this as grief in the traditional sense, there is still a disruption, a destabilization, a sense that something essential to their internal balance has been removed. The empath feels the loss of connection. The narcissist feels the loss of control. And when we understand this difference, something important begins to shift. The empath no longer has to interpret the narcissist's behavior as a reflection of their own worth or the value of the relationship. Instead, it can be seen as a reflection of a different internal structure, one that was never relating in the same way to begin with. Because the deepest misunderstanding in these dynamics is not about what happened. It is about what the relationship meant to each person. And once you see that clearly, you begin to understand a difficult but liberating truth. You were grieving a connection. They were reacting to a loss of control.